Hey everybody, welcome back. We are continuing our discussion with Blake Ostler today. In the last episode we kind of talked a little bit about the just an introduction to Blake and the first three volumes of Exploring Mormon Thought, which are Blake's work on an exploration of LDS theology. So now we're going to go into his fourth work, which is on the problem of evil. And so what we're going to do here is I want to start this episode by first just talking about the problem of evil. And for those of you who don't know, this is I'm going to give you the old classic version of it by Epicurus, who is kind of the first one to pose this problem. But you'll see it manifest in conversations all the time with people. Okay, it's a very common thing, and it's really something that beyond just sort of a philosophical thing, it's very personal. When you suffer a great tragedy, which people do, these go through their mind, these questions, and I think they're important to explore. So Epicurus said this. He said, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" So that's my little introduction to the problem of evil. Blake, I'm going to let you kind of run with it to discuss why this is such a big challenge and kind of steelman the problem of evil that's out there.
Yeah, I don't think that it's very hard to understand the problem of evil. We all confront it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to see why it's a problem. It's, we can take it on a human level. You've got a father who has the ability to provide for his children and who says he's willing to do it but doesn't do it.
Yeah.
You've got he's not really willing if he's able. And if he's not able, then he's got a ready excuse, but God can't use that excuse. So it's an easy problem to understand. I break it down in a little more detail, showing that if God is omniscient, then he knows about all evils. If he's omnipotent, we understand that to mean that God can basically do anything that's not a logical contradiction. And that's how it's been defined primarily in the Christian and Islamic and Jewish traditions. And it's obvious that, we've just got a logical problem here. The interesting point, though, is that one of the premises is what we would call a matter of fact premise. It's not a logical premise. You can say God logically has to be all powerful. He logically has to know everything. But can you really say that it's logically necessary that there's evil? And the answer is no. That's an empirical question. And so the real question is,
is that sort of the idea, just kind of for the less philosophically inclined, is that sort of the notion that evil doesn't exist, it's maybe the absence of good? I've heard that. Is that kind of the idea?
That's an Augustinian approach. Augustine argued that evil is really privation of being. And so what Augustine said is, when you have people who are dishonest, they're not being dishonest, it's a lack of honesty. Okay. When people are sick, it's not that they're sick, it's a lack of health. It's really a lack of being. And since God creates everything, the problem is somehow that, these things lack the kind of being that God has. They don't have the perfection of being. And so it's really a problem with the way that they exist. They exist contingently. Though you would think that if God is making things, he wouldn't make them quite that defective.
Yeah.
And so the problem is the pain, the kinds of things we experience just are not. Pain is just a lack of feeling good or a lack of not having pain. No, pain is a positive experience.
Mm-hmm.
And when people are in pain needlessly, it's an evil. And trying to explain that as a privation of being is really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to most people. When people are affirmatively evil, I mean, how many people have been intentionally put together Ponzi schemes or frauds? That's not just a lack of proper thinking. That's the presence of improper thinking.
And I think that's an important point to make here, because we're not just talking about even bad things happening. It's sort of this idea of evil people, like people who want to hurt innocent people, and that there isn't some redeeming sort of quality there. So the
Yeah.
existence of malevolence and the idea of, I mean, here's sort of an idea that, or what I hear people will say is sort of, well, if God can make people however he wants, why does he make people with these horrible desires? Why
Yeah.
does he make, I have one of my dearest friends recently passed away from muscular dystrophy. His whole life, and if you know anything about muscular dystrophy, it is horrendous. His old brother has it as well. And so it is gut wrenching. And then you go, okay, God made this. He could have controlled this however he wanted, right? And so
Right.
if you believe that God creates everything and that he's in total control, in my mind, as I look at the problem of evil, it's sort of like the issue in my mind, as I've kind of looked at it, is God can't be all powerful in the way that we think of him to be all powerful. Because if he controlled everything, he could use his power to stop everything, or to stop these things from happening.
Well, and there's one version that I'm going to talk about where God does have that kind of power and requires an explanation of why he would allow that kind of power. But I guess, there's also a peculiarly Christian problem of evil, and it's why does God create people that he foreknows are going to go to hell? People that would be better that they didn't exist.
Some
And
people.
yeah, well, the problem of hell. And if it's the case that God, especially with predestination is a particular problem of evil, right? Why does God predestine some to hell when he could save them?
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense. To me, it makes no sense. And I can't make any sense of the claim that God is nevertheless loving and good and does that. And I don't know many people who can. So, but in order to drive home the problem of evil, I use three specific instances of evil.
Mm-hmm.
One is a little girl in northern Utah who was about 5 years of age, who was taken, brutalized, beaten, and possibly sexually molested, and then left for dead. They discovered her body after she'd been kidnapped several days later. And how does allowing that to happen make the world a better place? And the other is I had a friend who had a little girl and a son. They'd just come home from church, and the neighbor had not put the parking brake on, and there was just a bit of an incline. Little girl was playing behind the car, and it began to roll. And she was with her brother. And the brother tried to stop the car, but it slowly rolled over and crushed her head. And the kind of, the havoc that it wreaked in the lives of the people involved in the death of the little girl. The reason I explain both is that, with the murderer of this little girl, that's a type of moral evil. The car rolling backward is kind of a mild human negligence conjoined with the way natural laws work. And then I point to smallpox, which is by far and away the most virulent killer in the history of the world. You want to compare our COVID deaths? Several billion people died of smallpox. Okay,
How many billion?
several billion, about 4 billion people.
And
I mean,
they weren't all old people that were close to death.
no,
They were children.
it preyed on on little children, and those that didn't die were often blind and definitely scarred because of COVID, because it left incredible pock marks on them. And so, when that was eradicated, by who? Because of the dedication of the vaccine, it was essentially eradicated by the 1970s. There was no more smallpox left in the world, except for the crazy scientists who thought it would be good to keep it around. So, yeah. So those are when you look at those kind of specific issues in evil, we then can ask, how could we possibly? I mean, every explanation.
If you don't mind, let me try and offer a thought on how people might respond to those, and you let me know what's lacking from these. So the first one, okay, it's a case of moral evil. Someone did something bad to someone else. Most people, the answer is going to be, well, God gave human beings agency, and if he wanted to give us agency, that is something that is for our good. In order to become like him, we have to have that. but that means that some people can use that to do terrible things like what happened to this little girl. Therefore, it's not a problem. Is that a sufficient answer?
Let's take it concretely. Let's say that you're there. You're much stronger than the person who's brutalizing this little girl. You see it happening, and you can intervene without any risk of harm to yourself. Are you okay just walking away? And if you interfere, let's say that you go save the little girl, you interfere in the killer's free will. Do you think you're doing something bad, interfering with his free will? The answer is that we just don't include free will as something that's so valuable that we couldn't stop it. Every time we stop our children from running into the street to get run over by a car, we interfere with free will.
But the question, why isn't God interfering in free will to stop terrible things like that from happening?
Yeah, I mean, the notion that this person's free will is so valuable, we ought to just step by and let him brutalize this little girl is just nonsense. And the problem with the kinds of answers that we come up with is they're so morally abhorrent, so easily rejected that we come up with these ways. And would we really justify this and say, oh no, his free will is so valuable, we ought to let parents brutalize their children. We should never stop that.
Yeah, no, we obviously believe that it's okay to interfere with people's free will, and that is a question. So yeah, God sends us out here. He wants us to have free will. Well, why doesn't he let us have free will, but then, stop horrible things from happening? I don't know. I mean, do you really have free will if he can do that?
Well, you can have free will if he can do that. God may have power that he doesn't exercise, and he may have a good reason for not exercising his power, which is really the most viable answer to the problem of evil, is that God has his reasons that you can't understand, and you can't understand God. God's so much smarter than you are. It's like comparing yourself to the distance between you and your dog in cognitive ability to understand. You take your dog and get a series of shots. Your dog's going through pain. He sees you standing there as the veterinarian administers the shots, and your dog has every right to think, because the dog doesn't understand germ theory. Mm-hmm. The dog can't understand why you would allow him to be subjected to these shots. They can't even begin to fathom, right? And we would argue the distance between us and God's at least that great. We can't even begin to fathom the reasons that God could possibly have for allowing evil.
I think that the problem with that, at least as I see it, is sort of an argument from ignorance. It's just like, well, we don't know, it's a mystery, so end of discussion. He must have his reasons somehow, which, while it may be it feels more like a cop-out than a good argument.
Yeah, but in a sense, it is a good argument because it is true that God knows a lot more than we do. This isn't a case where we should think that we can understand everything that God does, right? Mm-hmm. And it's reasonable to believe that God may well be able to understand things we can't even begin to fathom. I mean, this is not just a lack of knowledge. This is an explanation for how and why we lack knowledge to assess God's purposes. The real problem with that view is it leads to what I call moral quietude, okay? And that is that it would justify us in allowing virtually anything to happen or doing literally anything that's evil, because if it occurs, God must have his reasons for letting it occur, right? Mm-hmm. So God knows why he allows the little girl to be brutalized. So I come upon the little girl while she's being brutalized, and I think to myself, if this happens, God must have a very good reason for allowing it to happen, which brings about a greater good that I don't understand. So I'm just going to sit and watch it because God is so good. Well, that's just nonsense. I'm sorry. What it means is there's no moral obligation to do anything other than what actually happens. No matter what evil I do, it was all part of God's plan. He knew all about it. And even if I do evil, that must be to bring about a greater good. The problem is it makes nonsense of moral freedom, moral accountability, and any kind of motivation to do any good. And that can't be a Christian response to the problem of evil.
Yeah, because so if I'm understanding correctly, it's sort of like, well, if God can stand by and let these things happen, then, because free will is so important, and at the end of the day, it's all part of his plan. It's sort of in a way theistic determinism, where it's like, well, it must be God's will. Like, I'll just let it.
And in fact, whether this is a problem kind of depends on the notion of God that one has. If you're a Calvinist, if you follow what Thomas Aquinas teaches about God, then you've got a real problem here, because what you're saying is virtually everything that occurs is God's will, and God must will it because it's a great good. And so it's a real problem. It leads to this problem of moral quietude. That is, quietude is being so at peace with everything that you just sit back and know. It's like being on a marijuana high. We have que sera, sera. So,
So let it be. Whatever happens,
but
happens.
if you're an open theist, that is a person who believes that God does not know the future and all free acts, it may be that God can be justified in allowing some of those because he doesn't decide the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever greater goods God has to accomplish, he can't accomplish through the fact that he knows everything that's going to occur. Okay.
I see.
So it may depend on the notion of God you have as to whether or not this is a problem. But I argue that in the end, there's an argument that even open theism can't respond to. Now, if you want to pose other problems on the problem of evil, feel free to do so. Otherwise, what I'm going to move into is my next argument for the problem of evil. And
real quick, I do want to actually look into one more, but besides that, so because there are, in my mind at least, there's kind of two issues with the problem of evil. One is moral evil that we talked about, where people do things, and generally the thing that people go to is agency, is sort of the idea, the explanation behind it. The other one are natural evils. Okay, like something just happens. There's a storm that happens. And it's sort of this idea of just random things happen, and all of a sudden your wife's dead. Or all of a sudden, you have some horrible disease that afflicts you for the rest of your life, or whatever it may be. And there isn't some agent that you can point to. And so I guess sort of that one has always been the harder one for me to sort of explain away. And that when people run into it, they really get stuck. Because I think people can kind of wrap their heads around the idea of agency and, okay, maybe there's some purposes, but when it comes to natural evils, it just seems harder to do.
And I agree with you. I think that it is harder. And the reason it's harder is obviously that agency has nothing to do with those things. And let's make it real. The most brilliant person has brain cancer and suffers immensely from the progression of the cancer. And so what you're looking at is just this amazing suffering and the evil of destroying the personality from what's occurring. If that's not an evil, nothing is.
Yeah. No, I have I have a track coach who was diagnosed and passed away recently from ALS, and that was one of those things where I'm just like, well, what the heck is this? Like, how is it, like, did God make this happen? And that's the thing, is what is the cause behind this? What led to this? And if God is the cause of our world, then he ultimately would be the one responsible. With moral evil, you can blame it on somebody else. But it's very hard to figure out, if God causes the world, that he's not responsible, because he could have caused it in some other way where my coach didn't get ALS and die.
Oh, easily. I mean, just about anything with omnipotence has an easy explanation to avoid it that doesn't ruin free will. I mean, let's say that God didn't want the little girl to die, so what he does is he causes small aneurysms in the brain of the murderer, so that in the area of the brain where he doesn't desire to do any of those things. Well, that doesn't take away his free will. It just directs him and makes it so that he doesn't want to do what otherwise he would be doing. It's easy to come up with explanations where God could have done without the evil to still achieve the purpose. It's easy to come up with.
Well, you use an example in the book that I thought, this one really, really, really hit me. You had all those people who died of smallpox. Okay? Do we need to have 4 billion die? Could we have done 3,900,000,000? Could we have saved 100 million lives? Like, was it really that number exactly? The last person who died, was that really necessary to cause that suffering? And it ends up creating this idea of like, well, wait a minute. Like, why couldn't God have made it less and still achieved that same purpose? I believe you used the term gratuitous evil, or evil that is not necessary.
Right. It doesn't, we can't fathom any way that it leads to a greater good. No matter how you, And if you try to justify evil by saying it leads to a greater good, you end up justifying evil. It's a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
But right, the bottom line is that natural evils are not really amenable to explanation by free will, and they're clearly evils that ought to be avoided. And you can say, would the value of free will and the value of love and all the things that we really value be destroyed if this little girl weren't brutalized? And the answer is clearly not. that's that's not.
In her specific case, like we could have done away with that, and God's purposes still could have been achieved.
What's amazing is how easily defeated the usual responses are and how morally abhorrent they turn out being when we examine them.
Mm-hmm. So considering that, classic theism in my take, and I'm going to kind of summarize my take on it. One of the big challenges of classic theism is this idea of creation ex nihilo. So the idea of creation from nothing. God made it all. Okay, this is all his doing. Ultimately, because he's the prime mover. He's the cause of everything. So if he's the cause of everything, then he caused everything, including the bad stuff that's in the world, right? And that's because he technically, I mean, he could have designed it so that little girl didn't die, and he still could have achieved his purposes. And you can see how that could be. And so unless someone grapples with that from a classic theistic point of view, you have to rely. The only way I can see around that from a classic theist point of view is just to say, look, we just don't get it. There's some other purpose. We're just too blind to see. And while that may be all right, you can accept that. I think it's perfectly fair to start to look to see if we can find other conceptions of that. And so,
well, but that point of view, as I explained, leads to the problem of moral quietude. No matter what you do, you're justified. That leads to the problem that there is no moral evil. There's no moral accountability, and everything you do is just fine because it has to be a component in the greater good that God desires because that's what happened.
I see. Well, couldn't people say, and just to kind of respond to that, couldn't someone say, well, but God will work on you and act in you so that you could prevent that evil, right? You could, and that was part of his plan to do that. I mean, is that an appropriate response?
God would act through me to prevent the evil if it were the greater good, or he would stop it from otherwise occurring because he doesn't want it to occur. If it occurs, it has to be God's will that it occur, because everything that happens is in accordance with God's will.
So the fact that she was killed says it was God's will that she die.
Exactly. It had to be, or not
because
God's will.
Because either he would have stopped it through someone else, or
it was necessary to whatever greater good God was after. Okay? And who am I to prevent God's greater good? Let's just step aside and let the little girl be murdered.
Okay.
No matter what happens, it's always for the greater good. No matter what happens. And if you can rest assured that if something happens, it's all for the best.
It's sort of it's funny. I forget where I read it. It might have been a story about Lawrence of Arabia. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But there was this idea in Islam that people in Islamic countries, and it's funny because they actually say it in Spanish as well. They say "si Dios quiere," which is if God wants it. And there's a similar notion in Islam, kind of like, well, if it's all
Inshallah.
It's God's will. It's just and that more exactly. It's sort of like, well, we're not really in control anyway, which is great for your stress. I'll tell you, once you just kind of accept that what's going to happen is going to happen, you don't really have a lot of anxiety because it's just whatever's going to happen is going to happen. But that robs us of our moral duty to go and make the world the kingdom of God on earth.
Right.
Rather than just accept whatever happens is going to happen.
Islam is thoroughly deterministic. It's thoroughly fatalistic. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in that world, you have to say, when the towers came down, it was God's will. Okay.
Yeah.
And when the thousands of Islamic believers were killed by Christians, also God's will. But none of that makes any sense. What we're doing now is calling things that are clearly evil a greater good. And that's why it's morally abhorrent. And it justifies us in virtually doing nothing. Because if we sit back and let it happen and it occurs, it's all for the best. It's all for the greater good. That's why that argument won't work.
Interesting. So, all right. So we're dealing with these problems. Obviously, if God is the ultimate cause of everything in classical theism, you run into some real challenges with the problem of evil. Not a lot of great escapes from it.
Well, keep in mind there are very strong traditions among Armenians, among some Thomists. There are a lot of traditions that want to emphasize free will. Okay, and they would say that it's simply false that God causes everything. Now, Thomas would say that he causes everything proximally, but not directly. Calvinist would say he causes everything, but he works with people differently than he works with rocks. Okay,
Yeah.
so they want to maintain some sort of free will, still to exonerate God. The problem is that I've in my second volume I argue that the notion of creation ex nihilo entails a notion of what's known as occasionalism. Occasionalism is the view that virtually everything that occurs in the moment that occurs is directly caused by God, because God has to sustain everything in existence in every moment, and He has to create it the way that it is in every moment, or it winks out of existence. And so God literally has to create everything just the way that it is in every moment to be exactly that way. And that's what creation ex nihilo entails. It entails the denial of free will. Most Christians want to resist that.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, that sort of is ultimately, if everything is being caused ultimately by God, that it would then logically follow, if I'm correct, that the world is the way it is because of God ultimately, because He's the one who set the whole thing in motion, knowing exactly. It's kind of like if I build a machine, I know how it's going to operate because I built it and designed it that way. And therefore, if God is the cause of everything, He could have caused it to be different. But and this is something that I've always struggled with. And maybe, I don't know, I want to make sure I phrase this right. If God is ultimately the cause of everything initially, that doesn't necessarily entail, but you still could have free agents in that system, though. Could you not?
It's explaining. If you want to say God got things rolling, but then He introduces humans who have free will into it, and humans do what they want. They're not part of that determined order. That's what Armenians would argue. Okay. So you've got this strong tradition. What I argue, however, is that they accept creation out of nothing. Creation out of nothing means not only that God gets it started, but that in every moment of existence, the world depends for its existence on God. It's called divine sustenance.
So why is that? Why is it that it would necessarily depend on God?
Because it's not the nature of things that exist to exist. It's their nature to not exist without God creating it. Okay.
Okay.
God alone has the kind of existence that is necessary existence and remains in existence. Everything else is contingent
On
and
God.
depends on God's cause to keep it in existence. Okay, so the doctrine of divine sustenance, which is logically entailed by the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, logically entails that every single event that occurs is created to be exactly the way it is in the moment that it occurs by God, because otherwise it wouldn't exist. God has to create it in that moment because it's its nature to not exist.
Interesting.
And so God has to give His causal input to make it exist in the first place. And that's true of everything in every moment. Okay? So this notion of creation ex nihilo entails what philosophers have called occasionalism, which is the view that virtually everything that occurs is directly caused immediately by God by causing it to exist the way that it exists and all of its properties. And I give an extended argument. In fact, I give 3 different arguments in my second volume that are all in support of that conclusion. They all entail that everything that is created is sustained in existence in each moment to be just what it is in each moment. So virtually everything that happens, God's directly causing by creating it to be what it is in that moment. I argue that the Armenians have an incoherent view of free will because their view is inconsistent with the notion of creation out of nothing. It's also inconsistent with the notion that God has foreknowledge. Okay?
Because if people can make free choices,
they can do otherwise, But if God knew it 600 years ago that I was going to mow my lawn tomorrow, I can't change what God knew 600 years ago. It's inevitable that I will mow my lawn for whatever reason. It can't be different than God knows it to be. Okay.
I see.
I can't do otherwise. And in order to be free, I have to have this power to do other than I do. If all I can do is exactly what I do, then I'm not free. Okay?
So let's look at the so we've looked at some of these issues, and I think a lot of them stem from, I think, one of the core issues and differences between an LDS cosmology and view of the universe and creation and everything, and the classical theistic sort of Christian view, is this idea of creation ex nihilo. We reject that, and that is at the root of their belief system. It's a fundamental and important difference, and it has massive implications. So and obviously that's one of the big ones, but let's start to look at any of the other ones, including that one, as you kind of explore the LDS approach to this, and sort of what did Joseph introduce into the equation that helps with some of these.
So I look at three different ways that Joseph has been interpreted by Mormons in his relation to creation. So there's what I call God after creation, the view that God grew up in an already existing universe to be God. Obviously, he didn't create that universe in order to be what it is, because he became God by following the laws and learning how to master that universe.
This is sort of the endless regressive gods sort of idea into this one?
It's that sort of idea. I call that view finitism. Okay. And there are a lot of philosophical writings, for instance, by John Stuart Mill about finitism and a finite God. There's a view that's called panentheism, or process thought. So that view is God after the universe. Panentheism is God with the universe. The order in the universe is God's influence on bringing it together over time. Okay, God does not have coercive power; he has only persuasive power.
Good.
And he works on things over time to bring them to be what he wants them to be. He lures them. So it's kind of like, I want you to do what I want you to do, so I'm going to persuade you to do what I want you to do, but it's up to you ultimately whether you do it. And in every single moment, it may be that the universe doesn't follow God's persuasive power. The universe isn't persuaded, okay? And I'm being very general here.
Yeah, we can dig a little bit more into some of these, but go ahead.
So that's with the universe. Everything depends, the order that's in the universe depends on God and on the primordial creative power of every single bit of reality. This is a view that rejects creation ex nihilo as well. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so God has this kind of persuasive power. The third view is God before the universe. It has more in common with classic Christianity, Judaism, and Islam than the other two views. The order in the universe is due to God's organizing activity. God organized the universe. And God has been God from all eternity. Okay? So I explain the Mormon Godhead's existence as an eternal unity. In every moment that they could choose to love each other perfectly, they've done so. And this perfect love unites them in a way that gives rise to the divine power, knowledge, intelligence, and so forth, okay? It's because of their relation to each other that they have these powers. And in every moment where they could do that for all eternity, to choose to love, they have chosen to love. And they've invited us into that relationship. And the only difference between us and God is that they made a different choice. They've chosen to love in each moment that they could. We haven't. Mm-hmm. Part of what God is up to is to teach us how to love the way that they do, so that we're fit to be in that relationship. So what we're looking at here is that the God before the universe actually creates the order in the universe. Now, this is a view that's also consonant with rejecting creation ex nihilo. And so the explanation of natural laws is what, and I define this very carefully, it's divine concurrence. The power that something has to organize depends on two things, both God's power to organize it and the eternal natural propensities that this thing has. This is a very Aristotelian view of natural law, okay?
Okay.
So let me give you an example. We have 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen. The fact that they have the power when they are organized to create water is inherent in them from all eternity. That's just the kind of atoms that they are.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact they are organized in that way also depends on God's concurrent power to bring them into organization.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no water without God's organizing power, though there's hydrogen and there's oxygen that have these basic natural propensities without God having created them to be that. Okay. Now, humans are not the same way. We don't act of this deterministic natural propensity. Humans act out of organizing the data of their experience into a new reality freely. And so I give explanations of both what I call personal intelligences and natural intelligences. But these are basically the three views that I believe are open options for Mormons to adopt. Now, I use the term Mormons in contradistinction from the way that we've been taught to talk about Mormons, because it's just a common vernacular. Okay, I don't mean any disrespect to anybody, at least to Mormon.
I won't judge you.
Okay, well, it is called Exploring Mormon Thought, so I'm stuck.
Yeah, you're stuck with it. You already paid for the covers.
Yeah, and I'm not going to explain my personal view on all of that because I don't want to denigrate anybody. Anyway,
let's look at each one of them on sort of the way they interact with the problem of evil. So starting with the finite kind of idea of God, this idea of just that God, and maybe this is a bad way of doing it, is actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Kwaku. He's kind of he goes out and debates some people and stuff. And he kind of said one time, he's like, we basically believe in an alien that's super duper powerful. Like that's kind of it. And in kind of the finite view, essentially God is just another really, really smart being in the universe who exists within the universe itself and has kind of figured out the game, created us, right. And there isn't a lot of difference between God and just like a really, really smart alien who's on a whole nother level.
Well, no, I mean, what God is he's a super scientist who's figured out how to manipulate all matter and who figured out at some point that being loving was far superior in terms of happiness and results to not being loving. Okay. So that's the view. And God grew up in that universe by mastering those kinds of things. So I don't think the Kwaku is Kwaku. I don't know how you say it. I thought it was Kwaku, but that's me. And, that does capture, in essence, the view of a lot of Mormons. Let's just admit that. And it has this incredible, upside to that kind of a belief. It simply dissolves the problem of evil. The explanation for the problem of evil is that God simply doesn't have the power or the ability to actually get rid of all the evils that occur because he's overwhelmed. He doesn't have the technological capacity to do it. God is limited in space and time. Now, there are a lot of questions I want to ask of this view. How is it that God travels faster than the speed of light? If God's body got too close to a black hole, would he get sucked in and be able to get out? Because gravity is kind of the ultimate law in physics, right? And you can't really get out of a black hole easily. And if you do, you don't know where you're going to end up. And I want to ask if it really is science to adopt that kind of a view, because it seems to me you're going to have to deny most of the fundamental axioms of science to have a God that you're trying to describe.
And prayer. I think you pointed out in the book there's a problem with prayer in that.
Well, there's an incredible problem. Why would you pray at all? Because God can't. The reason bad things occur is he can't really change it. So you're basically asking a being who can't do any better than you're doing at the time to solve your problems for you.
But couldn't they appeal to the idea of it isn't that he can't stop evil because he's not able to, but that kind of couldn't they also still fall back on the idea, well, he's a super scientist, he knows that we have to go through these things in order to become like him and become a super scientist and figure out how to become the best being in the universe?
Well, sure, you can adopt the same approach as standard Christians at that point. It recalls for a theodicy to justify why God will allow things to happen, right? And then you have to explore within the context of that theodicy, does God really have that kind of power? And the answer is probably not.
And just so that those are listening, a theodicy is a justification for God's righteousness. It is the idea, it's basically your case of why God isn't a monster.
It comes from two words, theos and dike. Theos is the word for God. Dike is the word for righteousness or justification. So we're justifying God's permission of evil. That's what theodicy means. And so what we're looking at is asking, couldn't God just have a reason for letting everything happens that happens? And I would say, well, okay, but now you're not using any of the unique properties of the finitist view of God. God doesn't do it because he's overwhelmed or just doesn't have the power. He's finite. He can't stop it. So that dissolves the problem of evil. That's an incredible virtue. But if I want to say, well, God has reasons now for lying, now I have to test the reasons. Is free will and allowing these kind of things worth it for the kinds of evils that we actually experience to occur? And is it really the case that he can make a difference? Let's say that God lives near or on a star. He has a physical body, must exist somewhere. And let's say that we accept the basic axioms of science. So let's say that he lives on the closest star to us, Proxima Centauri, 4.2 light years away. Now you say a prayer takes 8.4 light years round trip, okay, for him to respond. That seems to be pretty limited to me. And so the kinds of questions I want to ask
It seems to neuter God.
Well, it doesn't merely neuter God. It seems to me that now the suggestion that you've made is, well, let's explore whether this kind of God has the power to do that. And I say it's doubtful. I haven't seen a well-developed view that actually preserves that kind of power. And two, does that explanation actually justify the allowance of that kind of evil? And I think we already explored and found out, not really.
Yeah.
And if we expand it greatly to explain all moral evils that way, we run into the problem of moral quietude again. We just become classical Christians with the same problem. So you can't expand God's power greatly, or you just recreate the problem of evil, and you have no way out.
Okay.
And so, it does solve the problem of evil if you say that God is just overwhelmed and can't really solve the evils that exist. But why would a Christian pray to a God like that?
Yeah, and it just seems kind of like that's really not an all-powerful God in any sense of the word, and I can definitely see why there's a lot of problems with that. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is sort of the process theist view, the idea of a God who, and I'll kind of summarize it kind of the way I read it in the book and kind of get your thoughts on it. So this idea was really interesting to me because it's sort of based on this idea of intelligences, and that all creation is these bits of what Joseph calls intelligence. It also is really interesting to me from a perspective of panpsychism, or the idea that consciousness that we tend to think of as something that's in the mind. There's an idea out there that everything is conscious on some level. We simply are a more developed consciousness. And that view is pretty aligns with this idea of everything is an intelligence, but there are greater intelligences. And obviously an atom of hydrogen is a really low grade consciousness, right? At an extremely low level. We simply are the conglomeration and organization of those intelligences or consciousnesses into a unified us. And that is what, kind of the view. And then you kind of go on to is if things are intelligent, everything has a degree also of agency, meaning that God has to persuade the atoms to cure someone's cancer, or for the universe to cooperate in his vision and plan and his building of the kingdom of God, not just on earth, but throughout all of creation. His ongoing creation is this interplay between God and these other intelligences of all different sizes to bring about this great kingdom or perfection or whatever it is. So that's kind of my take on it. I don't know. You can let me know how I did it.
That's a good way. I think that's a good way to explain to people who may not be familiar. And you're right. Process thought kind of simply does entail panpsychism. And, panpsychism is a live option. It's a view that a lot of people have considered, and it may well be true, though I think most people would be hesitant to say the rock has consciousness, that kind of thing. However, this view has 2 or 3 overriding values to it that make it really worthy of consideration. The first is that it also dissolves the problem of evil. The reason that there's evil is that God acts persuasively. He can't coercively stop evil from occurring, either naturally or moral evil. And though God would like to stop it, um, some people would say that this persuasive power is always morally superior. So God always acts that way because he's morally superior. And you can justify it either through the moral, or you can say metaphysically, God just doesn't have the ability to act with creatures that have their own level of creativity, where they have some say in the way the world ends up. He can't unilaterally dictate what the world is going to be. It also seems to be more consonant with what we know of biological evolution and the way that things actually work in our universe. I mean, the bottom line is that this is what one would expect to find, and in fact, we find it. Mm-hmm. It's also more consonant with quantum physics. Alfred North Whitehead at Harvard actually developed this idea because he was aware of quantum physics and was saying, look, matter isn't really little bits of matter. We've discovered that. It's more like little bits of creativity, events that occur and that evolve and develop over time into something else. Mm-hmm. And so the little bits of reality, he calls them actual occasions in his philosophy. They're the intelligences in Mormon thought.
Yeah, it is funny. As I've looked more into some of the quantum theory and stuff, I've been like, this kind of seems like I can see some parallels between this idea of intelligences and what they're talking about. But
yeah, and that's exactly how Alfred North Whitehead developed this process view. He didn't apply it as much as Charles Hartshorne on a strictly religious level, mm-hmm. Looking at theology. So you've got these two overarching geniuses that kind of drive the view. And I develop a complete theodicy explanation of evil given this view of God. It seems to me to be a live option that is worthy of real consideration, and it may well be true. It faces some real problems. So, for instance, I asked the question, could God guarantee victory over evil on this view? And I think the answer is kind of, it's up for grabs.
It can't be guaranteed, but we could place our faith in his promise that it will, but that isn't what the scriptures say. The scriptures kind of say, no, it's guaranteed. Now we could say maybe that was a good sales tactic that he used, but
well, this way, God is the most persuasive power in the universe, and he never gives up. So over time, maybe we can say God is guaranteed to prevail just because he's so loving, persuasive, that eventually everybody will come around. But the problem is with free will, there's just the logical possibility that everybody may not come around, right? Yeah. It may be that the person who doesn't come around is in your family. Mm-hmm. And that's the way that it actually is, because it's up to them to choose what their lives are about. It seems that God has to allow this kind of thing, and he can't guarantee the salvation of everybody.
One thing, just I wanted to, as I read this, there was an insight that, because I struggle a little bit with the idea of prayer, and I need to read more of your work on some of the ways to reconcile the idea of prayer. But I thought this one was really interesting, the way you talked about communal prayer. And you talked about this idea that what we're doing is we're joining with God to persuade the intelligences, the nature, the fabric of reality to cooperate with him and us as we join together in love and in petition that X thing will change, and that prayer then becomes a real power to actually do things. But it's not a guarantee, because like God trying to bring about his creation and to make everything wonderful, we also have to deal with the fact that reality does not always cooperate with us, and that's just the nature of it.
Yeah, and I think this is also strength of process thought. What we're saying is prayer has a true meaning. We add our impetus, whatever power we can add to realizing God's will and our alignment of our will with God's will. And the alignment of more people is going to have a greater causal influence on the universe. So it seems to be a very good explanation for both individual and corporate prayer as well.
And just the idea that we're co-participants with God. We now have become conscious enough to a level that we can begin to do the work that he's doing to build the universe into what it needs to be. That's a cool kind of perspective.
It is, and it makes us co-creators with God. And this is the view that I held probably for about 15 to 20 years, saying, I think this is the way that it actually is. Mormon thought ought to be interpreted that way. I'm not quite as convinced of that at this point, but I still find it to be a very inspiring and persuasive view. The question I have is, why am I praying to God? Because if it happens, it's because he can't really make a difference, even though he wants to.
Yeah. Why not pray to the
And
intelligence?
yeah, he seems to be at the mercy of a world that he may not be able to really bring in line with his will. And is that really consonant with the scriptures? And is it really consonant with ultimate faith in God? I mean, in the lectures on faith, God is the ultimate ally. That is, God can always make sure that his purposes are realized,
Mm-hmm.
and his purposes are righteous. And so we want them to be realized. But on the process view, I'm not quite sure that's true.
Mm.
The kind of faith we have to have in God, it seems to be a bit attenuated because we have faith in God, but maybe if there's a recalcitrant universe, he's not going to win this one. Okay.
Yeah.
Or even overall, he might be overcome. Maybe everything, just kind of all of a sudden turns around and devolves into chaos, and everything is lost, and God can't really stop it from
Well,
happening.
as I've pondered this idea, I've thought, well, maybe that's the development of a sort of heaven and hell and kingdoms of glory. The universe will eventually, parts of it will glorify to be what God wants it to be, and other parts of it will remain at different levels of this creation based on the cooperation of creation with God.
Yeah, and God's kingdom is where God's law applies, and it's followed, and God's will is done.
Mm-hmm.
That's what God's kingdom is. Those outside God's kingdom, they've rejected God, and so they live in chaos, and that's kind of a hell.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot to say about this point of view, and it may well be true. And it's clearly the way that Orson Pratt and B.H. Roberts, general authorities in the church, interpreted Joseph Smith. And so I think it's got a lot of credibility in the Mormon worldview, and I think it ought to be seriously considered.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly it's not the view that I propound and adopt, but I say that it's a live option for Mormons to consider and a strong contender. Okay.
Okay.
The next view is God before the universe, where God actually does what the scriptures say he does. He organizes the order in the universe. He creates the order in the universe. And the difference between this view is that on the finitist view and on the process view, the universe is recalcitrant. The reason bad things happen is that it resists his will.
Go ahead and define that term, recalcitrant.
Oh, it resists his will.
Okay.
It works against him. Okay. He's got to persuade it, and it's not easily persuaded.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just working against him.
Okay.
On the other hand, the world this is what I call an agape theodicy. Okay, it's kind of a continuation of my agape ethic. And what it is the purpose of life is to bring us into unity with the divine God, with the divine person, so that we're one in them as they are one in each other. To do that, we have to learn how to love each other the same way they love each other. And the purpose of life is to teach us how to love each other in that way. But that takes some work. We're not really there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so the world is set up to teach us how to love in the way that we would be fit to enter into that relationship. And when we enter into the relationship, just as they partake in the fullness of divine knowledge, the fullness of power, fullness of intelligence, the fullness of divinity and glory, we also will participate fully in that, just to the same extent they do. We'll have the same knowledge, the same power, same glory. Okay?
Okay.
So that's the goal. And there's nothing that could possibly be greater than that goal.
Hmm.
I mean, if you think about what is the apex of value that's possible, think of the greatest thing you can possibly imagine. It's this.
Yeah.
And God's inviting us into this relationship to realize this kind of a love.
And I would say too, just for me, from an intuitive level and an experiential level, what is the thing we all value most? We all ultimately, if you ask everyone out there, what's the most important thing in your life, they're going to start talking about relationships with other people. And so I think it fits very well into that intuition that we have, that if relationship with others is what brings the greatest joy and satisfaction, that brings that transcendent joy, what is the greatest form of that?
Yeah, and this is what it is. It's why the nature of godliness is happiness, because we're the kind of beings that thrive in fulfilling intimate relationships. It's just the way we are. It's the kind of things we are.
Well, and also I would say John 17, I've always said, is probably my favorite chapter in Scripture. It is, and I think a lot of people miss the significance of the, like, you just remember, this is the last prayer he says before the atonement. It's kind of like the closing prayer on his ministry. It's like,
Right.
this is going to be something really important. And what does he say? It's this idea of oneness. And what's funny is I get so annoyed when it's portrayed as just like, oh yeah, he just like wants us all to be unified. It's like, this is so much deeper
Yeah.
than that. He
Well,
wants
I
you to enter
explain it
into
this
a
way.
oneness, like the way that he's one with the Father. Like, this is a big deal. Don't just say this was like Biden giving a unity speech, okay? It was so
But
much bigger than that. Anyway,
what it says is the technical Christian term is co-inherence. They co-inherent each other. That means that they actually live their lives in each other. What one wills, all will. What one does, all do. What one knows, all know. And so they have this kind of, and it's not just that they agree in purpose. I keep explaining to people, I played football. We all had the purpose of winning the game. It did not make us divine. Okay? So far from it. We were the opposite of divine. So, you're going to have something more than just, yeah, we've all got the same purpose here. So the purpose here, and think about it, this is a towering good of such superlative value that it would justify any finite pain or evil that we had to endure in order to realize it. So what I'm suggesting is that there's something that is worth confronting anything you can think of in order to realize it, as long as it's not eternal. And of course, this is what the scriptures teach. God gave us the commandments to teach us how to love one another. They all come down to just one commandment: love each other as I love you. That's it. That's Christianity.
yeah.
And so God has set up the world. He's ordered it to serve us as a teaching arena in which we can learn the lessons that will teach us how to love one another.
Mm-hmm.
And some kinds of lessons are more tailored to tutoring, and others are just more general to everybody, that we've all got the same kind of things to learn. So
Okay.
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so I'll kind of approach my half-baked theodicy and see how it kind of coheres with this, because I think it has something in common with it. And I use this analogy when I talk to people about this life. Is I say, look, so I do jujitsu. My boys do jujitsu with me, and it's, if I kind of control everything that they do and don't let them go out there on their own, they're never gonna get good and grow. Okay, it's kind of the idea of your children are in your house, but at some point you gotta send them out into the lone and dreary world, and they gotta face stuff on their own, or else they just can't make it. That's how it goes. And so I've oftentimes framed this issue along the lines of this idea of less about evil per se, and more framing it as this idea of injustice. The world is unfair. And unfair means unfair. It means that the girl that wasn't supposed to die got killed. And it means that it is God's presence has been removed from this, and then chaos essentially exists. And it is only within this sort of an environment that such growth, I mean, there is in our scriptures, no doubt, this idea of the necessity of opposition. But I even say more than that, because people will question, well, why did he have so much opposition and he had so little? In my mind, I say that's the point. It's unfair. And it's sort of the parable of the talents. It's like, you don't all get the same thing. You all get different things. And the only question in this experience isn't what happens to you. It's how you react to it. And what did you learn from living in hell, essentially? Living in a world that's fallen, that is broken, that is on a fundamental level, like, it sucks. And that's that sort of an existentialist view. My view is that the world is not worth living without salvation. Like, I don't believe existence justifies itself for its own sake. I really don't. I think that there has to be some sort of a justification for it. So my view is very much like yours, that life exists so that we can form relationships with God and with other people. And I even argue with creation itself, that we put ourselves in relationship to this divine plan. But part of that plan is that you have to step into the arena where it can just happen. Now, so that's kind of my rough view. I know there are some critiques to it, but anyway, I'll just give you kind of...
I could easily fit into my outline of the agape theodicy. It's all part of it. The necessity of opposition in order to learn to appreciate the sweet and the good. We have to confront the bitter and the evil. And the reality is that it's even worse than that, because Jesus is asking us to do something really remarkable. He's not just asking us to love people who are lovable and easy to love, okay? They're easy to love. I don't learn anything by doing that. I love them anyway. Mm-hmm. The real problem is learning to love our enemies, people who really challenge us, because they're not only are they not easy to love, sometimes the injustices that they impose upon us are so great, it's just unfathomable that I would love that person. Overcoming my desire to just knock their block off is really difficult. Mm-hmm. And so the reality is we have to have the type of people in our lives who are not easy to love if we're going to learn how to love. It's the kind of challenge where sometimes it feels like we're having our guts wrenched out. And I would say that evil is more than an injustice. If you're passing a kidney stone, you just don't think, oh, that's unfair. You think, this hurts a lot. And so we experience those kinds of things too. And oftentimes, I've had pains that were so excessive. I had shoulder surgery. It felt like for about a week, somebody was taking a knife and going like this in my shoulder, driving the knife in. And I was thinking the whole time, this hurts a lot. I'm not learning anything from it.
It just sucks.
Yeah, no, it does suck.
But I guess, but I would push back on that a little bit with the idea that, but the thing that kind of sucks about it is obviously what's happening, but on some level, it's unfair. You didn't do anything to deserve that.
No, it's right. A part of what makes it suck so much is that it's just pointless. It's just pointless.
Yeah.
It's like, I can't even see how this functions.
Because we can endure any kind of pain if we feel like there's a point to it. It is that the problem with gratuitous suffering is that gratuitous suffering is not necessary, and therefore it feels it's unjustified. Well, I guess that's what it is. We can't justify it.
Man's search for meaning. A human can survive any evil if they have a purpose in surviving it. Mm-hmm. And that's true. If I were fulfilling some noble cause and feeling the pain I were feeling, it would have been a lot easier.
Yeah.
It was no noble cause. I was just in pain. So, but the bottom line is, at the end of the day, I think, and I argue this, at the end of the day, when we look back at our experience, we realize that it was the toughest times in our lives, the ones that knocked the air out of us, that knocked us to our knees, that made us cry endlessly, that made it was so dark we didn't think we'd ever see the light again. And when we look back on those experiences, we realize they were the greatest blessings in our lives because of what we learned from them that we couldn't learn in any other way than confronting them. And that's my experience. I'm 63, and so I've lived long enough now to have that perspective on some of my life's experiences. Mm-hmm. And the greatest challenges I have been my greatest blessings. And I could tell you, but I don't want to get too personal on that. But the bottom line is what this theodicy focuses on is how God's plan operates. Now, one of the greatest problems in any theodicy that uses free will as a justification for evil is, or the soul-building notion that we're talking about. It makes us better people to experience life. Well, what about all those who experience pain and evil who don't really get a start in life? Mm-hmm. And I saw an estimate that probably 1/3 of the world died before it got to age 2. Okay? And the reality is that how do you explain what little children go through when they can't really benefit from it in any way? This is a real challenge to this type of theodicy. Joseph Smith I think gives us a perspective on why the value of a little child's life is still incredible, even if they don't experience much life. And gives us a reason why these people are the perfect volunteers to be the ones who bear the brunt of evil at times. And I go through that in the book as well. I think Joseph Smith gives us a unique perspective and window to explain why little children who don't get a start on life nevertheless have valuable lives, and that they benefit from their experiences, even if they're brutalized as little girls. And that I explain that at length in the book. You've read the book, so you know. But this is the toughest part of any theodicy that bases a part of the value of life on what we call soul building. I'm here to learn from it. I'm here to grow as a person.
Yeah.
Well, what about little children who can't even start? How is the evil that they
Well,
experience worth?
I would so let me try and give at least my ugly attempt at answering that question. Is I think that I guess my view is that we have this life on Earth. We then have essentially another life in the spirit world, before that everything kind of the plan of salvation kind of comes to an end in conclusion. And in my mind, it's sort of like, again, this idea that the world's supposed to be unfair. And so in an unfair world, kids die. And if you're the unlucky kid who got chosen, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything. It's just welcome to chaos. You decided to come here of your own free will. And this being in chaos, you can get smacked by a car or something else. It's like things can happen. And so, and it isn't part of any individual plan except for the plan that you have to pass through the chaotic realm into the spirit world. And so they did that. They played their part in the world, and the works of God were, as Jesus said, manifest through them because they were the one who suffered the brunt of the chaos. But all of that gets kind of accounted for in the great accounting of the atonement and through the soul building that they can still experience on the other side of the veil. I don't know if it's a great explanation, but it's my attempt.
In my view, any theodicy has to include an afterlife to be able to make sense of our human experience.
Absolutely. And that's another unique contribution of Joseph Smith, is sort of this idea that, hey, this is just like a part of it. Because as you're saying, I don't know how any theodicy or idea of a plan of salvation works without the idea of another experience beyond this one.
But look what you not only gave an epilogue, you gave a prologue to life. We chose to come here. We chose to confront the evils. It was a free choice. We consented to come into a world that had the kind of evils that we actually confront. This makes all the difference in the world. So, for instance, if I'm a doctor and I just decide that for the benefit of humanity, I'm going to do an operation to discover whether or not it works. And so I just randomly pick somebody and do the operation. I'm an evil person.
Yeah.
It's what the Germans were doing in World War II.
Uh-huh.
But let's say I go through and I pick the best candidates and I say, will you consent? Here are the dangers. Here's the benefit to be derived. I've run it by the board, the AMA, and they think it's worthwhile. Will you consent? If the person consents, then it's justified.
Mm-hmm.
What Joseph is saying, we all consented to this life. When my kids were young, I remember my oldest son yelling at me, I didn't choose to be born. And I looked at him and said, oh, yes, you did. You chose to be born in my family, you darn it, you little snot. So, the bottom line is...
And this spanking is God's will.
Exactly. So, but we ask for volunteers all the time, and these people are volunteers to be... Some of them, look, when a child is born into a family with a history of alcoholism, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental illness, physical problems like MS or all kinds of things that we can think of. Certainly God knows that they're going to go into that family with a certain probability of experiencing those kinds of problems.
Yeah.
It seems to me that God has a duty in that kind of a situation to explain to the intelligence, to the spirit, this is the family that you're going to. Now, it's a perfect family for you to teach you what you need to learn. But here, they're the propensities of this family. Do you still want it? Would you still choose this family? They're good for you. Because the fact that your father's an alcoholic may teach you to love in a way that few people learn to love.
Mm-hmm.
You may learn you may gain from this so much that you'll be 5 lifetimes ahead of everybody else.
Well,
Okay.
I remember on my one of the first kind of serious confrontation. I think this is common with kind of the problem of evil and suffering was when I was on my mission. I served in Argentina, served in some poor areas. And I got to know obviously some people in some rough circumstances. You know, I knew a girl who had a baby and she was about 14 and that baby was her uncle's son. So, I mean, it was like, you know, I'm in this situation. Here I am, a naive 19-year-old, and, you know, I'm going, how do you square this? And I remember I read the parable of the talents. And I felt like that had such a, I don't know, and maybe it was just my own personal take on it. I don't want to say that it's the take that everyone needs to take away from it. But I just had this thing that they didn't all get the same thing from the master. It was just, and not only that, they weren't even expected to return the same thing to the master. It was tailored to them, and it was based on, it isn't based on what happens, it's just based on how you react, right? And
Isn't the parable of the talents that, in fact, they all do get the same thing regardless of how long they work?
yeah, that's the other one. Yeah. And
So, I mean, it seems to me, and I like the way you're using this parable because you're right, there are two of them and they work against each other.
mm-hmm.
But in the parable where everybody gets the same, no matter regardless of how they work, that's kind of how it is in the kingdom of heaven. If we learn to love the way that God loves, we will participate in the most fulfilling reality possible. We'll be invited into the divine relationship. We will be everything that God is and have everything that He has. And we'll be in such a fulfilling relationship that the joy and happiness that we will feel will cause us to give glory to God and praise Him because of His goodness. It's not the case, you know, and God knows this. And so He's urging everybody, He's trying to persuade everybody, this is what I want for you. But you have to freely choose it for this reason. And this is the center of the agape theodicy. Love can't be coerced. It can't be something that's chosen for you by somebody else. It has to be your full-blooded choice. And this is the simple fact. You cannot have the blessings of a loving, intimate relationship unless you choose to love freely from your heart. You've got to learn how to do this. It's this central choice that has to be free. And that's the reason that free will is so valuable. Free will per se may not be valuable, but free will toward the choice of a loving relationship that has the potential of the divine relationship. Now that's valuable. And it's worth anything that we need to confront to gain it. So that what the theodicy does is it explains why free will is so valuable. It explains why confronting opposition and being placed in a world that calls for compassion because there are true evils are present. It tells us why we keep confronting the same problems over and over and over again until we get it, so that we can learn how to love. And it places the proper emphasis on what Christ actually taught. Love each other.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I think is impressive about, again, going back to sort of these ideas that really are rooted in the Restoration, is that they reconcile so many things. They kind of create this narrative that, and I've always told people that Joseph Smith's, the most impressive thing to me about Joseph Smith and the Restoration and sort of these ideas that came from it is their ability to comprehend so much. Mm-hmm. Everything from cosmology to theology to, you know, soteriology to, I mean, you can harp about, you know, things in the history and all that, but it's sort of like that. I'm, at the end of the day, I'm a believer who's trying to understand God, and what is offered here in my mind, just it's miraculous and it's powerful. And, you know, the problem of evil, like you said, it's where I think in another podcast you admit that I heard about this, you said that it's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And I think that you're right on that. We all face pain and suffering. And ultimately what the plan of salvation really is, what is it salvation from? It's salvation from the hell of suffering and that we can experience. And I really appreciate you coming on today. I appreciate your book because I really do think it gives, I also, as a little last note, I still am in the process of kind of understanding my own theology, right? and constructing it. And there are still questions and things like that. And I guess I feel like that's okay, right? I don't think that we all have, it isn't like, I think people, they grow up in the church, they get kind of the primary story, and then they start to get confronted with harder issues, and there's some ambiguities or things they don't understand, and it's kind of like they panic over it. When it's sort of like, it's okay when you, once you get into the deeper ideas here, it's okay to have things that you're not sure of. It's okay, like you have 3 separate possible options within Mormon thought that are okay, you know, and we got to kind of sort out some of the details ourselves. But I think that your book definitely provides some excellent insight into all of this, and specifically in this 4th volume with the problem of evil.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And you're absolutely correct. I'm still working on my theology too. Mm-hmm. And I think here's what I would explain. Here's what I see happening. Paul Ricoeur talks about a first order naivete. We all kind of grow up in the church. We don't have the ability to fully understand because we're kids.
Yeah.
It takes time to understand. And we develop this way of seeing things when we're still young and we don't have the ability to put things in perspective. But as we grow, Paul Ricoeur talks about a second order naivete that's critical of the first order naivete, but it's still a naivete. It's still, you know, you're just kind of, okay, well, this is the answer. And then you expect to have answers. There's a third order naivete that kind of deconstructs all of that. And as we go through life, I mean, what I see happening, I see so many kids finding out that the first order naivete won't work. It's like, oh, I thought I was always going to believe the same way I believed when I was 8. You know, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like,
you have to go through the process of growth, and it can be a challenge.
Yeah, and I want you to go through these challenges. I want you to go through the challenges and know that it's okay to not know, to not be sure on a lot, because we're not. This is human life. We weren't sent here to be omniscient. We were sent here so that we could live making free choices without really knowing fully everything that's going to happen, not knowing whether or not we've got the right value system even. I mean, when it comes down to it, we're massively ignorant of a lot. And so, but this notion that I'm supposed to have it all figured out, and if you don't answer everything, it's not, you know, I've got to reject it. I think the response to that is, I don't think you understand how human life works. I don't think you understand how the life of the mind works. So, and certainly I don't think you understand the limits of human cognitive ability. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are very limited in what we are able to do. So, you know, we've talked about a lot of highfalutin ideas here.
Yeah.
and I'm good at highfalutin ideas. But at the end of the day, this comes down to, like you said, I've got to see what feels good to me. What tastes sweet was Joseph Smith's term, right? I've got to see what tastes sweet to me. And at the end of the day, the agape theodicy tastes sweet to me. It gives me a view of angels all about me, and some of them are just the people in my own life. It gives me a view of not a recalcitrant world, but a world that was lovingly created to assist me on my way. It gives me a view of why love is so central to everything that Jesus taught and everything the gospel is about. It brings it together for me in a way that makes sense of life. And here's the big benefit. Any religion that doesn't have the ability to explain evil in a way that makes sense of it is failing in the gift that it should be to its adherents. Joseph Smith's teachings put evil and our life experience into this incredible panorama of a life beforehand, a life after, and the purpose of our life here. It gives us that meaning that allows us to actually survive and thrive through any suffering, through any evil that we confront. It gives us the tools and resources to put things into a perspective where we thank God for every experience that we have. That to me is the greatest value of the gospel. That's what it does for me. It assists me to put my life into a perspective where everything I experience has meaning and love in the relationships that I have and the person that I would choose to be a better, a kinder, more loving person than I am. And I'm still working on it. Trust me. I've got a lot to learn.
I got it all figured out, man. I don't have any problems with that. Well, Blake, thanks so much for coming on. I've taken a lot of your evening. I really do appreciate it. I appreciate your books. I encourage people to watch the videos of you on YouTube that are out there, to read your articles, and if you want to really dig in The Exploring Mormon Thought series is excellent, a great way for people to explore a really serious take on our theology and some of the big questions that are out there. And appreciate everything you do. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Jacob. You take care.
Take care.